And on behalf of the faculty, staff, and students here at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for tonight's event. Before we begin this evening's program, I'd just like to remind you to turn off any cell phones or other electronic devices that make noise as to not distract the speaker. Also, following Mr. Hirshberg's remarks, we will have a brief question and answer period. If you'd like to ask a question during that time, there are microphones located on either side of the two center sections. And just go up to make a line at the microphones and ask and speak clearly into the microphone. Tonight, I am honored to introduce co-founder and chairman of New Hampshire's Stonyfield Farm and founding partner of Just Label It, We Have the Right to Know, Gary Hirshberg. Mr. Hirshberg is the author of Stirring It Up, How to Make Money and Save the World, a novel advocating for sustainable and health-conscious ways to pursue profit in the competitive marketplace. He also serves as the co-chair for AGRI, an agricultural policy initiative formed by the Ford, Gates, Kellogg, Rockefeller, Walton, and other leading foundations. For his corporate and environmental leadership, Mr. Hirshberg has received 12 honorary doctorates and numerous awards, including the 2012 Lifetime Achievement Award by the U.S. EPA for his work in organic foods. Gary is a New Hampshire native and an alumnus of Hampshire College of Amherst, Massachusetts. Tonight, Mr. Hirshberg will present the debate over labeling genetically modified foods. He will discuss the fact that through the influence of the lobbying of large chemical companies within the United States, many Americans do not know what specifically they're eating and what they're feeding their children and families. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Gary Hirshberg.
Thank you. By the way, one of those honorary doctorates is from right here, so it's nice to be back. Some of you weren't maybe born then, but so it's actually amazing timing. I don't know exactly when we set this up, but I believe it was last fall. It's amazing to be here tonight because of some activities that are happening in D.C. as we speak, literally today, and starting with a bill that was introduced last Thursday by Representative Pompeo from Kansas. And I'll get into this in a little bit, but let me just give you a sense of what I'm talking about. My favorite philosopher is Lily Tomlin, and she has this great line. She says, "No matter how cynical I get, it's hard to keep up." And when you hear what I'm about to describe, you'll probably feel the same. Representative Pompeo's bill was at the urging of the Grocery Manufacturers Association, which is the largest lobby of the major food companies and grocers in this country. And they've been threatening this bill as a result of some successes that are happening in the labeling movement, both federally and in the states around the country. As you may know, 2 states have now passed mandatory labeling bills, and a third, Vermont, is probably about to. And so Representative Pompeo's bill does lots of things, but the 3 primary things it does are, one, it codifies the word natural. It requires that the FDA's definition of natural, which right now there is no definition of natural. If you see the word natural, it may make you feel good. There might be a cow or a barn on the package, but it actually literally means nothing. There are ice creams out there that don't change shape when they melt, but they say natural on the label, so you can judge for yourself whether that's natural or not. But his bill would codify the definition, a federal definition of natural as including genetically engineered foods. Now, I don't think there's a citizen in America who believes that that's natural. And as a matter of fact, you can look no farther than Monsanto's own website for a definition of what it is to be genetically engineered. And it says, literally, the definition of genetic engineering is transferring genes from one species to another in a way that could never happen in nature. In other words, this is a manipulated process. So now to have this become codified as natural is, I guess, only in Washington can something like that happen. And unfortunately, I don't think the bill will pass, but it's going to take all of us to work on it. And if by the end of my talk you aren't moved to join me and write and make sure our Congress people know this is not the bill to sign up with, then I'll have failed. The second thing that this bill does is it preempts states from taking action on labeling. it requires a federal solution to labeling. And as you know, we just had a debate here in New Hampshire at the Senate and the House. But there's a debate, as I'll share with you, going on in 26 state houses across the country right now. And I need to say what I said to both sides in the debate here in New Hampshire, which is ultimately this really does need to be solved at the federal level. This is not, we can't have a hodgepodge of state labeling laws, and yet at the same time, as has often been the case in this country, literally from the founding, oftentimes initiatives, especially when Washington is as dysfunctional as it is right now, and I don't think anybody in this audience needs convincing of that, oftentimes initiatives really do have to start in the states. And we've seen this time and again. You're seeing it right now with same-sex marriage, with medical marijuana. We've seen it with menu labeling. Restaurant menu labeling. The women's suffrage movement began in the states before it became federal law. A number of states had passed the right to vote for women. But even think back to the founding of our country. It began with 13 little startups, right? These 13 crazy colonies, these entrepreneurs, political entrepreneurs who said, we want to codify a different approach, and so again, this idea of preempting states is, I don't think in the interest of the citizenry certainly, but I also don't think you're going to see much support sort of popularly for this. So they're trying to kind of move this through without kind of as a stealth effort. And that leads me to the third point. The third major thing that they're seeking in the bill is to require the FDA to finally come up with a permanent policy. Right now, the FDA operates under a voluntary guideline, and I'll tell you a little bit about the history of that in a second. But the permanent policy of the FDA would be for voluntary labeling. That is to say, you can label if you have an absence of genetically engineered, but there's no mandatory requirement. In fact, this law would forbid mandatory labeling, and frankly, that's just codifying exactly what we have now. And again, when you start to understand a little bit of history here, you'll see that is not really a terribly progressive move. So the fact that this bill was introduced last week and I'm here talking to you tonight is a bit striking. This is a eye chart, I appreciate, but this, and I won't take you through every bullet, but this just gives you a sense of the history of what's gone on with these crops. The point that I would draw your attention to is 1992. Then, and I wonder if his picture is here, I guess it isn't, but a guy by the name of Dan Quayle, who you'll remember was our vice president. You might remember he wasn't known for his spelling. Dan chaired something called Vice President Quayle chaired something called the President's Council on Competitiveness. And this was basically an effort to streamline and get regulation out of the way of industrial development. And this was actually quite brilliant because, as you see on this chart, the first genetically engineered crops weren't even on the market yet. They weren't introduced until the Flavor Saver tomato in '94, and then the BT corn and the herbicide-tolerant corn in 1996. But in 1992, anticipating their approval, the President's Council on Competitiveness directed the FDA to adopt a voluntary guideline that said that genetically engineered foods are substantially equivalent as non-genetically engineered foods. In other words, they're no different. And the basis for that was that organoleptically, you can't see, smell, or taste the difference between a genetically engineered tomato and one that isn't, or genetically engineered corn or soy and one that isn't. And this is kind of interesting because if you go back to the first bullet here, you'll note that another part of D.C. had the exact opposite policy, which is to approve these as being patentable. In other words, they're absolutely different, and the first patents began to be awarded, and as a matter of fact, they've millions and millions of dollars have been spent protecting and defending these patents. So to sort of summarize, we have essentially a bifurcated and really schizophrenic policy in D.C., federal policy. One branch of government, the Commerce Department, says they're absolutely unique, they're patentable, they're defensible. The other, over at the FDA, says they're no different, and therefore it's not material to the consumer. What's tragic about this story I'm telling you is that was 1992, a long time ago. And now that remains the policy of the land today. GE crops have made their way out into the market, and as you can see here, they're some 80% of 80 to 90% of corn, soy, and cotton are genetically engineered. And again, I'll take you through some of the other history. So when you're looking to see where are these crops, understand that when you see this list, it basically means that almost all the processed food we eat contains genetically engineered material. But as was mentioned in the kind introduction, most of us don't actually know this, and there's no way that we can know this because it's not on the label. And there's a whole host of very interesting crops now on the horizon. There's a corn that is actually resistant to 2,4-D, which is a very, very toxic and carcinogenic herbicide. Anybody here with gray hair will remember 2,4-D. It's 50% of Agent Orange, which we used as a defoliant in Vietnam. There's a multi-generational legacy of birth defects, cancers, et cetera, not just with American vets, of course, but with generations of several generations now of Vietnamese children. It literally it's a congenital defect that has been passed along. We have an apple that's about to be approved that doesn't brown when you cut it open. We have a whole host of others, including genetically engineered salmon, which gets genes from species, including from the pig family, and certainly from other fish as well. So we're into a kind of a brave new world here. It's important to note as we sit here talking in the U.S. that we are pretty isolated in our policy about genetically engineered labeling. As you see this chart growing from 1996 to the present, you see the number of countries around the world that offer their citizens the right to know what's in their food. Literally, really progressive countries like Russia and China and Saudi Arabia give their citizens the rights to know whether they're eating genetically engineered foods. We just don't seem to have it here, all of the European Union. And you may have seen a news bulletin that came out just yesterday about China rejecting GE corn. Japan will not take GE wheat. So this is a trade issue, and it's an issue that is in both the EU free trade agreements and the Trans-Pacific Partnership on the other side. This is a big block. In fact, this is the block because these countries are unwilling to accept our approach to IP, which is essentially, as was stated here, a result of corporate lobbying. I want to make you a graphic example here of what we're talking about so you understand we're not looking for a skull and crossbones. This is what we're looking for. This happens to be a Hershey bar from Sweden. We're asking to join the rest of the world, and by the way, that number is 64 nations around the world who mandate labeling. What that means is that 60% of the world's population lives in countries where they have the right to know what's in their food, just not here in the land of the free. And again, we need to examine this, and we will tonight. But what we're talking about here is not, front of label screaming. Although it is interesting that Brazil adopted labeling, and you should see the symbol there. If you haven't already, go online. It actually has teeth on it. This is not what we're arguing for. We being just label it. We just simply want it to be on the ingredient label. And I also should point out, I was speaking recently to a major grocer. I was on a panel with other experts talking about this, and one was a lawyer from Brazil, where they got this symbol with teeth. And she went on to say that although, despite the fact that it's a symbol on the front of the panel with teeth, it has not changed purchasing habits at all. What it is, and it has not affected pricing at all. When you saw the big full-page ads here in New Hampshire in January, the GMA, the New Hampshire Grocers Association, and others were saying it's going to result in an increase in increased cost of food. There's simply no basis for that. It's a scare tactic that has worked very effectively in a number of states, especially where seniors, people on fixed incomes are involved. But there's zero evidence in any of the 64 nations where we have labeling that it has led to an increase in pricing. And in Brazil, where it's screaming on the label with teeth, no change in pricing of genetically engineered or non-genetically engineered. And it hasn't affected purchasing habits. What it has done is for those who read labels, roughly the 10 to 15% who care, it has given those folks a choice. And so a lot of the scare tactics we can now look at other countries, which is why, again, I remind you that the fact that federal policy in this country is still what it was in 1992 Now, obviously many, many years after, 20 some odd years here later, we have some experience here that we can draw upon that could really, I think, elevate the debate beyond the hyperbole. And before I move off of this international point, I want to just share with you this ad. Not sure if you can read much of it back there, but you should know that this is an ad in the UK. And I have a version that also ran in France. And essentially, I'll just cut to the important paragraph here. Monsanto fully supports UK food manufacturers and retailers in their introduction of these labels. We believe you should be aware of all the facts before making a purchase. That's apparently if you're British or French, but not if you're American. Because this is the very same company that has spent tens of millions of dollars, as I will show you, trying to stop that very same thing from happening here. What's going on here? Why did they take out this ad? They had no choice. Because the EU, unlike us and the UK, when they adopted, when they approved genetically engineered products for production and for marketing, they said we're going to approve it, but it has to be labeled. They just mandated it at the same time. Whereas here, they fought labeling altogether. So here they had no choice. This is just a PR move. Not that any company would ever engage in cynical PR, but here you are. And this was an interesting piece that rolled out last summer that said that actually Monsanto is not only now advertising that they support your right to know over in Europe, but they've actually stopped all applications for GMO crops at the European Union right now. They're literally, you can read some of the lines in here, but they're really focusing on, as you see, non-GMO business accounts for more than 98% of the almost $2 billion in sales that they booked in Europe. So they're concentrating on the non-GMO side of the equation. So you say, well, they're doing that over there. What are they doing over here? Well, what they're doing over here, and I don't mean to pick on Monsanto, they're one of 6 companies, Dow, DuPont, Syngenta, Bayer, BASF are all active in this, and unfortunately many of the large grocers and large food companies have fallen into this, is they're busy out sharing propaganda, talking about the fact that, for example, we need these crops to feed the world because they're proven to have higher yields. I will tell you that they may well prove one day to generate higher yields, but they haven't yet. And I know that sounds like heresy in the face of an avalanche of advertising, but this one report from the Union of Concerned Scientists is but one of dozens. And when you get into the scientific literature, you will find and see case after case after case where researchers are declaring that this is just simply not proven yet. I want to be really transparent here. I'm not opposed to the idea of genetically engineering. There's 1 million diabetics alive in this country right now because of advances with genetically engineered insulin. And so to say you're against the idea of genetic engineering is to say, you're against science or progress. And I'm not. Go over to my little, company down the road here, and you'll see one heck of a lot of science and scientists who make us possible every day. But I do believe that it needs to be that at the same time we need much more independent and long-term testing to corroborate the propaganda of the patent holders. And you have to understand that these patent holders are making a lot of money on the seeds. They prevent farmers from saving seeds, something that is as old as humankind, and then they make a lot of money on the chemicals that are effectively required in the use of these crops. And so, again, look at the data, go to the science, and you will see that these claims of yields, not there yet. Maybe they will be one day, more testing, etc., but is required. But as of yet, we don't see these data. And I should say, by contrast, we do have hard data in my space, in the organic world, that we can, in fact, get higher yields than GMO or conventional crops. This happens to be a snapshot of a 30-year side-by-side analysis from the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania. 30 years, you can go visit these fields yourselves. Side by side, both patches are about twice the size of this room, where, again, you can see, I don't need to read the bullets to you, they've had higher overall yields, and particularly during drought conditions, because with organics, when you're adding organic matter to the soil, you now have more moisture holding capacity inherent in the soil, which means that in drought conditions, organic tends to do better. And now I'm going to make you really angry at me because I actually missed this long winter that you just had. I've been in California all winter, where, as you know, there's a drought happening. And I will tell you that my several hundred friends out there in organic grapes, organic dairy, organic fruits, vegetables, etc., the organic folks are enduring better under drought conditions because, again, the soil retains moisture better. I'm a backer of a farm in Canterbury, which was a sod farm, where not only was the sod taken away, but the topsoil was taken away, feet of topsoil. And this piece of land is absolutely prospering because now, 2 years later, because with hogs and with chickens, we're actually literally bringing back, the soil is now brown. It was sandy soil 2 years ago. We're increasing the nutrient matter and increasing the carbon matter and retaining more moisture in those soils. So again, we have contrary data to what the other side says, but lest you think Rodale is some kind of communist plot or lefty thing, go no further than one of the leading land-grant universities in America. This is Iowa State University, where research has been going on since 1998 that shows exactly the same thing. Higher yields, either the same or higher yields, with much, much better economic returns from organic methods. So when you hear organic cannot feed the world, I will share with you a slide at the very end that will explain that. But you just need to understand that organic is basically a rounding error in the picture of American food. The good news is we're a $31 billion industry, which is great, compared to where it was when Stonyfield started, which was you couldn't use the word organic and industry in the same sentence. I often joke that back then we had a wonderful company, just no supply and no demand. But today, organics is a big industry, but to be fair, it's only 4% of U.S. food. And research money and lobbying money and all are proportionally much, much less. And so when we hear organic cannot feed the world, I'm telling you the science says otherwise. And the UN, no less than the UN and many other international groups, says now in published reports that there's no way we're going to feed sub-Saharan Africa without organic methods, mainly because farmers can't afford non-organic methods. And so this is just a bunch of propaganda. You have to cut through this. But also when you hear organic cannot be economical or cannot produce yields or only GE, well, you really have to look closer. Now, let me bring this around to labeling and the reason that we're here tonight. To be fair and to give credit where it's due, there were several claims made about genetically engineered crops back in the 90s here. One was that we would see dramatically decreased insecticide use because one of the very first patented crops has an insecticide built into its DNA. It's called bacterial thuringiensis. It's a naturally occurring insecticide. It's actually approved under organic methods, and it's now actually in the DNA of these corn crops. In fact, there's 3 different species of Bt that are in there. And the claim was that we would see less overall insecticide use as a result, which of course was not a very bold prescription because it's now in the plants. So yes, we're spraying less. And to be fair, we've spread, according to the USDA, in the first 15 years of this cropping out there, we used 123 million, we sprayed 123 million less pounds, okay, which is a credit, I suppose. But on the other hand, again, you have to look deeper and recognize that now where we used to use insecticide on a very stochastic basis when you had an insecticide problem, kind of like overusing antibiotics, we're now that it's in the crop all the time, we have another problem, which is that rootworms, which is what this Bt actually attempts to control, are now developing resistance. We now have 5 or 6 different species of corn rootworms. In nature, they don't wait around when the bugs are under assault, they don't wait around to do focus groups like humans do, right? They just mutate and evolve. And in very short time, again, since the mid-1990s, these species have now evolved to where a formerly effective insecticide is no longer effective because this worm is actually actually now resistant. So that means we need stronger insecticides. We need new species. So, this is, again, you have to look a little bit deeper. The other promise that was made with Bt corn was that the insecticide itself would not get into our bodies. It would not pass through our saliva, that it would break down in our mouths, let alone with our other gastric juices. Yet this study came out in Canada in 2012 showing now that Bt is present in the cord blood of pregnant women. We've now seen this study replicated time and again. In other words, the second claim that Bt, that this insecticide would not show up in our bodies, has actually been proven to be false. And now we see this means essentially it's in the fetus. It means that infants being born right now have an insecticide in their tissue at birth. And again, this is not debatable. This is fact. The biotech folks don't argue with this. They call this a management problem. Now, this leads me to divert a little bit for a moment before I plunge into what I think is really the biggest problem with labeling. In 2008, the President's Cancer Panel, which is the most prestigious oncologic panel in the country, maybe in the world, leading oncologists, very, very prestigious position, 3 oncologists who chair this, who were appointed by George Bush, by the way, reported to the new President Obama in this report here called Reducing Environmental Cancer Risk, that the really terrifying and tragic statistic that 41% of Americans alive today are going to be diagnosed with cancer in our lifetimes. And the smoking gun that they implicated was that environmental factors, notably chemicals in our day-to-day exposure, explicitly and specifically pesticides in our air, water, soil, and our food. And you can see the byline down below. This was a devastating piece of data, and again, it wasn't partisan at all. Republican-appointed committee reporting to a Democratic administration. The sad part of this is that despite Michelle Obama's success with focusing on obesity and being physically active and so on, there's been really no action at all on this report, none. And the problem is that when you go into the statistics, they've all only worsened. It's now 1 in 2 women, 50%. It's now 1 in 3 women, 33%. It's 1 in 2 men will develop some kind of cancer. And again, it isn't that our bodies have evolved, it's that there's something going on environmentally, as the report shows. It's now 1 in 8 women who will have cancer. Breast cancer, it's a 40% increase in the last 40 years. This is a trend line. Everybody in this room knows somebody dealing with breast cancer. I assure you, when I was the students' ages here, that was a very rare occurrence. We've seen an increase in prostate cancer over 40 years, et cetera. And again, what you have to really follow here is what's going on environmentally. Well, what's going on is that our species, and particularly here in America, we have experienced a chemical incursion, the likes of which has never been seen, obviously, in history. In the last 60 to 80 years, we've seen chemical exposures now to the point where a baby born in Manchester or in Memphis is likely to have some 137 compounds in her tissue at the moment of birth right now. And half of those are known carcinogens. They're not at carcinogenic levels, of course, because we don't know what the carcinogenic levels are for babies, because we don't test it on babies, but they're present. And this is not, obviously, probably a very good thing for our species. And that's the ones that we've tested. And this brings me to the reason that I believe we need labeling of genetically engineered foods. And I want to underscore this. I want to summarize what I've said to you so far. We cannot yet say whether genetically engineered crops are bad for your health or not. Nobody can say that. We can't say they are, we can't say they aren't. And so there's a lot of hyperbole on both sides, and you heard it in the New Hampshire debate. But to be clear, the science is absolutely inconclusive on either side. When the pro-GMO side says the most tested crops on earth, they've been proven to be safe and sanctioned, I will show you for every one of those studies a study that says the opposite. I will show you scientists who say you cannot make those claims. And who are very upset by the overweight, the weight of lobbying forces. But we cannot say the crops themselves are unsafe. What we can say is there hasn't been adequate testing. there hasn't been adequate long-term testing, and there definitely hasn't been independent testing. Unfortunately, unlike drugs in this country, which require enormous amounts of peer-reviewed testing before they get approval, there is no testing required for chemicals. And some 5% of agrochemicals out there have been tested for any kind of health impacts at all. It is not a requirement before they're introduced, despite the President's Cancer Panel report. So, but what we can say for sure is that the use of these crops has absolutely contributed to the skyrocketing increase of these chemicals. And I'm going to give you the example here. The second leading trait, I told you the first trait that was introduced in crops, which was insecticide-borne crops. The second leading trait was for herbicide-tolerant crops. These are crops that literally you can dump herbicide on and they won't be affected. And if you just, anybody here who knows anybody who farms knows that historically, since the introduction of chemicals in agriculture, basically between World War I and World War II, we would use herbicides in a very tactical kind of rifle shot way. We would, when we put seeds in the ground, we would then do a dusting of herbicides to kill off anything that would compete with those seedlings, so that when the seedlings sprouted a week later, and by the way, these were short-lived solutions that would disappear. So a week or two later, when the seedlings would come up, there would be no weeds to compete with. They'd have a couple of weeks head start before the weeds came back, and that was usually enough. And then occasionally, if you had a real breakout of weeds, you rarely used herbicides, because of course, once your plants were going, your plants would be damaged. But now we've got a species of new life forms, a variety of species, that are herbicide tolerant. And what this means is that farmers are now using these herbicides all season long. This means even literally at the finishing of the season. And you can talk to corn and soy growers who are now spraying these herbicides in the final 2 weeks to give their crops a final push, because again, the herbicides aren't going to affect their cash crop. And so we were told in 1996, and I have testimony from, in fact, I have testimony from the Quail Commission from '92 that says we will use less herbicides as a result of these new crops. Well, this is the USDA data. Directly related to the increased use of herbicide-tolerant crops, we have increased by over 500 million pounds the amount of glyphosate, that's Roundup, as you would know it, and that's through 2011. The 2012 data is just being finally synthesized. It appears that it's going to be close to 750 million pounds, and that means that we're probably over 1 billion pounds by 2013, by the time last year's data is going to be tabulated. This means that every acre, every hectare of corn, soy, and cotton has seen increased herbicide loading of enormous proportions. Now, you're probably thinking, why did I come listen to the most depressing guy on earth tonight, right? I'm going to come around to this not being, to what we can all do about this. But this is, you got to see the facts for what they are. Understand that when biotech companies, when you see the ads, like they broke in New Hampshire, that says, labeling is going to drive up the cost of food. Labeling is going to stop a technology that we need to feed the world. This is the safest proven technology. You'll never see them talking about this. Why? This is their business. They're in the business of selling chemicals. You know what? I have to help you. You are more than welcome to have that. No, that's okay. I'm glad you didn't leave, but I'm going to give you a hand here. So don't worry. Listen, it's a tough time of year. Lou's fighting it. Everybody's got this. April's always cruel, so hang in there. Have a yogurt; it'll help. Anyhow, here's what we're faced with now. In the Midwest right now, in Iowa, 60 to 100% of rainwater samples, 60 to 100% of rainwater samples now contains glyphosate. Do you know what that means? It's raining herbicides. That means if you're pregnant in Iowa City right now, or anywhere in Iowa, and by the way, we're all downwind of Iowa, right? You're getting herbicides in your water, and it's showing up as a contaminant in streams. That's what's resulting. This is not an academic thing here in papers and data. This is the U.S. Geological Survey's data. This isn't Gary, okay? So this is what's going on out there. And this is across the Midwest, of course. These just happen to be 2 states where they were tested. And so the reality is that what they will tell you is, hey, glyphosate, we've been using it for decades. It's proven to be safe. You've heard this before. It's not harmful. The truth is, that might be true at the lower levels that we were used to using it for the last bunch of decades. It is known as one of the more benign herbicides. I have many, many farmers, non-organic, who say, hey, I've seen the data, it isn't that bad. But we've never used it in these concentrations. And now, you see this one study here from India. These studies are showing, Sri Lanka. These studies are showing up all over the world, that increased glyphosate loading is starting to show human organ results. One of the really scary ones, and this is the head of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences at NIH, who produced this report. She talked about environmental chemicals now being essentially like uncontrolled medicines, except unlike medicines, we don't regulate them. There's no approval process for these. All that has to happen is the foxes, the chemical companies, just have to say, yeah, we've tested them and they're fine. I hate to be, shattering any, illusions here, but that's actually our regulatory process at this point. That is a result of the kind of lobbying forces that you heard about in the introduction. And so this is the key line in this report from Professor Birnbaum. In the same way as medicines are delivered to produce effects in the endocrine system, environmental chemicals can be similarly delivered to produce unwanted endocrine effects. Well, one such endocrine effect that we're starting to see across the country is the skyrocketing increase in autism diagnoses. And so a former staff scientist at the U.S. Navy did this tracking study to look at individuals under the Individuals with Disability Education Act, looked at a correlation, not a causation, I want to be clear on this, and showed a remarkable correlation between the increased use of glyphosate and the increase in autism in this country, which is, again, now epidemic. And I venture that everybody in this audience, again, knows somebody who's been diagnosed with autism. This is being talked about at NIH as an epidemic in this country. By the way, ADHD diagnoses, same thing. When I was a kid growing up here in Manchester, nobody was diagnosed with ADHD, and they say, well, is this, increased diagnostic methods? And there is some debate in the medical literature. Maybe we are diagnosing too much. Maybe just hyperactivity. I was a pretty hyper little kid. Maybe that's being overdiagnosed. But the reality is that the trend lines are now beyond a diagnosis problem. This is a real phenomenon. Brain cancer in children, and again, is on the rise. Same trends as autism. Again, neurological effects, something's going on out there. You can't say it's glyphosate, you can't say it's these herbicides, but yet something's going on out there, and you've got to look at environmental factors because our biology has not changed in this at this rate. So here's what we're looking at now. 1 in 68 children, and that's an extraordinary number. And when you go through the data, you'll see that's unparalleled in history. Now, I wish I could tell you that's the end of the depressing stuff, that we're, dumping too many chemicals. We're probably having health effects. Nobody's tracking them. As a nation, we do not track the cumulative effects of over time. We have no idea what exposure to small dosages over time, like, again, subtherapeutic levels like antibiotics or hormones. We also, more importantly, and I believe future generations are going to look back and wonder aloud about this. We don't track anything. We don't track synergistic effects. We have no idea what the impacts are of a baby being born with 136 compounds in her tissue, right? Or what happens when 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 compounds are accumulating in your bloodstream? So we do need a lot more research. Unfortunately, these are direct consequences of the overuse of these crops. There's no debate about this, and yet there's one more, even scarier one now that I'm going to share with you, and that is something that you've probably read about or heard about, which is that as a result of overusing herbicide-tolerant crops, we now have weeds like those corn rootworms that have become resistant. Again, no focus groups, they just evolve. I was testifying in Arkansas recently, and a farmer stood up, a corn grower, and said, I have a pigweed in my fields that is 12 feet tall, it's the diameter of my wrist, and it will stop my combine in its tracks. And I can't stop it with glyphosate, with the herbicide that I've used and my daddy used. So in their inimitable wisdom, what the chemical companies have told him is, we've got a solution for you. Mix in a 10% solution of 2,4-D with your glyphosate, and that will control them. They stood right up at the meeting and said this, and this is what's being prescribed across the country. And now Larry Steckel at the University of Tennessee, one of the leading weed scientists in this country, and Dave Mortensen at Pennsylvania State are out saying, don't do it, farmers, because you overuse this herbicide. You're going to create 2,4-D resistant weeds. And this is what we're facing now. These weeds are all across the country. They cannot be controlled by, again, a formerly effective herbicide in small dosages. And as you might imagine, it's not just the weeds that are resulting. By the way, Dow has now introduced a 2,4-D resistant corn. Okay? And the EPA is about to approve it. Because for a lot of reasons that I'll get into in the closing part of this discussion, having to do with the real power in Washington with these lobbies, the USDA's ability to regulate based on to regulate a 2,4-D corn has been absolutely neutered and pared down to where they can actually only, there's something called the Plant Pest Act, which is in bad need of renovation, and it can only, under the Plant Pest Act, the USDA can only stop a new organism from being introduced if it will damage other plants. So the fact that it's leading to the use of all of these herbicides and creating these resistant weeds is not a basis for the USDA to stop this. It would seem kind of logical, but that's the case. So now it's been flipped over to the EPA, and the EPA is, has no long-term studies on exposure other than a legacy of Vietnam veterans and Vietnamese, which I think ought to be enough for the precautionary principle, but nonetheless, it's probably about to be approved. A corn that will resist 2,4-D. What that means is we're going to sanction the use of a known carcinogen across our farmland. And as I started to mention a moment ago, these herbicides are not just affecting plants. They're affecting pollinators. Bee colony collapse is now being looked at as a direct result of excessive amounts of herbicide. A paper came out in February showing increased soil compaction across America's farms now because soil microorganisms are dying when you get, with the herbicide residue. And when the microorganisms die, then you have less channels, less breakdown, less decomposition, and so you get soil compaction as a result. And this is, again, no one can say this is cause and effect. We haven't done the studies yet because we're getting increased levels of these herbicides at such rates that it's hard to keep up with. But nonetheless, it's clear that we've got a sort of a chemical inflation happening. Now, I'm here at the Institute of Politics, so let me shift from science to politics, and let's talk about what's really happening here. First of all, you should know that the Mellman Group, independent pollsters, have done multiple versions of the same study showing that over 91% of Americans, when asked, say they would like the right to know whether their food has been genetically engineered. It was interesting, when Dick Mellman did the press conference last January and announced these results, he also said 91% of Americans don't agree on anything. This is the first time in history that he has seen this. There's no statistical difference between Republicans and Democrats and independents, men and women, rural, urban. This is all of us, okay? I mean, virtually all of us. So understand that, in a democracy, that ought to carry some weight. I showed you a little bullet on the second slide that 1.4 million people have signed a petition to the FDA demanding mandatory labeling of genetically engineered foods. You should know that's the largest number of petitions to any federal agency in the history of the federal government. And yet, again, under the Obama administration, it still has not happened. You know this. I don't think I'm telling you anything that you haven't heard before. But what you should understand is that they're particularly broken when it comes to environmental politics. Did you know, for example, that in the period from 1960 to 1994, in the federal government on a bipartisan basis, over 130 pieces of federal environmental legislation were passed, signed by Republicans, signed by Democrats, on Republican administrations and Democratic administrations. Did you know that since 1994 there has not been a single environmental protection law enacted in the United States? Again, you do know this, that's why you're here tonight. But we've got a problem. okay? 18 years without a single, and we certainly have some problems out there to deal with. This is, I love this photo. You know, here's a Republican president signing the Clean Air Act of 1990 with his Republican head of EPA, Bill Riley, behind him. And by the way, note the guy over on your right applauding this piece of legislation. This is the very same guy who, at the same time period, was convening the Council on Competitiveness, stopping the possibility of citizen input in the process. And I should have said this to you at the beginning. Let me say it again clearly. No, there's been no citizen input in the decision to whether to label genetically engineered foods. This is a voluntary guideline adopted by the FDA under the leadership of an industry led council led by this guy. But here he is, nonetheless, applauding a piece of landmark federal legislation, and he should be applauding, and we should be applauding them. And yet here we have a situation with really a chemical nightmare happening to us, and nobody, again, in Washington, is acting. Now, why? Of course, we know a lot of what's gone on in Washington. You see this, 20 to 40% more lobbyists than when that bill was signed. Extraordinary. The revolving door with congresspeople who don't really leave town. Now we're seeing expenditures in the $3 to $4 billion plus range per year. Well beyond, you know, we could pass a hat tonight, right? What are we going to come up with in this room? I mean, Lou sees it. We all see it even here in New Hampshire, the inflation of these cost of our races locally. Watch what happens with the Brown-Shaheen race. It's going to be, you know, I mean, this is a nightmare. And the Supreme Court is, by 5 to 4 votes with Citizens United and last week's decision, are essentially endorsing it. But let's look a little bit closer at this issue. Here you have, since 1998 to the present, the lobbying dollars, and this is available. You can get this online. This shows you what the proponents, the chief patent holders, have spent to help sell their goods in our country. I mean, look at these numbers. They're way out of relation to anything that, you know, average citizens can come up with. This is certainly not what the framers had in mind. This is a broken system. Extraordinary. BIO is the Biotech Industry Association organization. So, in fact, the Monsanto, Dow, DuPont, Bayer, Syngenta also have given money through BIO as well. So, again, and I've been living on Capitol Hill for a lot of my activities. You know, you can't attend a single hearing on Capitol Hill about anything to do with agriculture without their lobbyist present. Even immigration reform. These guys are sitting in the room, okay? And of course, you know, lobbying is not the only source of use of proceeds. You see also, you know, these kinds of numbers going into PACs, and this is just at the federal level, and so of course locally there's dollars. And we saw it here in New Hampshire. You saw full-page ads being taken out to stop what ultimately was a pretty narrow win for them, as it was in Washington State and California. The question we have to ask ourselves, and especially the students here who are coming into the world and graduating into all of this, need to ask is, you know, what direction are we headed here? I believe, despite the bad news, the good news is that social media and the ability nowadays to expose the kind of data that I'm sharing with you, and for us all to speak up through social media and to telegraph our opinions to our representatives and to food companies, by the way, who are part of the lobbying problem, gives us a power that we haven't had before as well. And what we have to understand here is that this is what we're facing as a nation. You know, staggering. I mean, the cheapest form of health care is not getting sick, right? I mean, wherever you come out on Obamacare, you know, if we don't get sick, we're doing a lot better. And yet, this kind of chemical inflation has to really be looked at, has to be a priority. And so we've got to start speaking up as citizens and as consumers in terms of, you know, what we believe. And again, I believe that we need the right to know whether our foods have been labeled because we have the right to know how they're being grown. When the big guys get out there and say to you, they're safe, you know, we're not arguing for labeling because they're safe. If we thought they were unsafe, we wouldn't be arguing for labeling. We'd be arguing that they should be banned. We're asking for the right to know because processes are important. And by the way, interestingly, since 1996, think about the processes that we can now know because they are mandatorily labeled. Orange juice from concentrate. There's now a regulation. They have to disclose. I defy you to tell me the difference if you taste orange juice from concentrate versus fresh. You might say, oh, of course I'll know. But still, it's organoleptically the same, but yet there's a law. It's now mandated by federal policy that you have to say. Country of origin. You can't taste the difference whether a tomato was grown in Chile or California. Farm versus wild. Irradiated food. You must label food if it's irradiated. Now that's an interesting example because the irradiation proponents are proud of their technology. They believe that it helps with food safety and they wanted it labeled. So that flew right through the FDA, no problem. No congressional act needed whatsoever. You now have the right to know. But yet we have a problem here, which is that the very likely cause of this kind of inflation on our economy and this kind of tragedy is not, that we are not getting that same right. So as I mentioned before, 26 states are having this battle. It really shouldn't be done at the states, but unfortunately, as with so many efforts over the course of time, it has to be. This is really, unfortunately, it's going to take a few states to get us there. Of note, speaking of money, I thought you'd be interested in this little analysis that my group just did. So in California, Proposition 37 was the first citizens' effort petition, a referendum to try to get mandatory labeling. You should know it failed, but only by 1.8%. It was the most expensive ballot initiative in California history. $57 million was spent to stop Proposition 37 against $5 million being spent on our side, on the pro side. But what's interesting is that when you look at the companies who funded the no on 37, look down the list and you'll see a whole bunch of familiar names. And then Washington State, a year later, the 522 referendum came up, and note the companies that dropped out. Note companies there that had funded, spent a lot of money to stop Prop 37, but backed away. What happened? Well, what happened was consumers started to email and call these companies, because what these companies, when they're funding these no propositions, are really saying is, we don't want you to know what we're feeding you. That's really what they're saying. And what's happening is the food companies are starting to realize that they really don't have to carry the water of those top two companies at the very top. That, Pepsi probably a better example is Kraft. They don't really want to be responsible for increased herbicide use. They don't want to be responsible for Monsanto's profits. So they slipped out of this thing very quietly. And you can see the long list of companies that have dropped out. And now referendum are up this summer, right now, this year in Colorado and Oregon. And you're seeing even more of these companies dropping out. So this should give us a little bit of indication of where our political power lies. We certainly aren't going to outspend these guys, but we are all consumers. And while we vote once every 2 years or once every 4 years, the fact is every time you buy something, you vote. Every time you run an item past a scanner, you vote. And if you can start speaking to your grocer and mention right on those little suggestion cards, and believe me, I have a business that grew this way. Okay, I know this is how it worked. We can start saying, I'm not going to buy your product unless you label it. You're going to start to see it. A Cheerios, one of the 11 forms of Cheerios that are out there, is now labeled with GE. Grape Nuts is now labeled with GE. Walmart stood up 10 years ago and announced they're no longer going to buy milk from cows injected with synthetic growth hormone, genetically engineered growth hormone. They didn't do this because they heard Gary come talk in St. A's one night. They did it because they heard from thousands and probably millions of consumers. And that was and the day they made that announcement, synthetic BST died, went away. So I believe that we have an enormous amount of power. I'm not suggesting to you that we still shouldn't be politically active, and obviously you're here tonight and you're here at this wonderful institute because you understand that. Because again, we still do need our federal government to be accountable, and I'll give you an illustration here. This is beyond just labeling. This is what we're supposed to be eating according to current federal nutrition recommendations. This is the federal food pyramid. But when you look through the last Farm Bill at how we're subsidizing, where the subsidies are going in this country, check out a couple of things. First of all, we're supposed to be eating grain. It's the base of our pyramid, a lot more. But we're getting 13% of the subsidies are actually going into grain, despite the fact that it should be the majority of what we're eating. Meat and dairy and protein gets 74%. That's largely corn, to be honest with you. Again, exactly as we would say, bass-ackwards here. Sugar, oil, and salt, we're supposed to use it pretty sparingly, 11% of your and my tax dollars going in. So, and fruits and vegetables, which we're supposed to be eating sort of second most to grains, it's essentially negligible in terms of federal subsidies. Now, fortunately, the last Farm Bill did start the process of course correcting on federal subsidies, and some heroic efforts out there by Environmental Working Group and others have shined a light on this. But again, this is not unimportant, and again, this is where we as shoppers can have an influence. Another critical area I showed you just a few moments ago, and especially here in New Hampshire, where small farmers are the backbone of our state. Stonyfield has 1,800 dairy farmers across the country that supply our milk. The average herd size is 92 cows. But here in New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine, average herd size is 46 cows. Our farmers are small. We're working on small and marginal pieces of land. But I already showed you that these small farmers can make more money organically, and yet we're 4% of U.S. food. We only get 1.5% of federal research. Now, this was slightly improved with the last Farm Bill. But again, we've got some big problems in Washington, but we need to be speaking. And I would submit to you that in addition to speaking to our representatives and our congresspeople, we really ought to be speaking to the food companies that we shop from. I hope you will take some time after this evening, go to justlabellit.org, sign our petition. I hope you will get an email off to Representative Pompeo. You can do it at justlabellit.org, saying, natural should not be genetically engineered. This is not something that I support. If you have friends or family in Kansas, give them a holler, okay? Let them know. But you can write to food companies and tell them this, because the GMA, the largest food companies in America, are the ones who put Pompeo up to this. They were looking around for a stool pigeon to get it done, and I'm sorry to be derogatory, but this is exactly what he is in this case. This is not in citizens' interest. This is an incredibly cynical effort. And we're going to do everything we can to fight it, and you can do that at Just Label It. You can also at Just Label It find the names and of these large food companies who you really ought to talk to. And I'm not suggesting write to Monsanto or Dow or DuPont. They're not going to really be responsive to us. This is what they do. They make a lot of money. But Kraft and Nestle and Nabisco and everybody else out there, these are the companies funding this kind of legislation, and it really needs to stop, because this is a national tragedy. And I'll despite the amount of depressing stuff I shared with you tonight, let me end on a hopeful note. Gandhi had a great line. He said, anyone who thinks they're too small to make a difference has never been in bed with a mosquito. And I think it really remains true. This is, after all, how this democracy came to be. We think, you look at climate change, you say, why isn't it happening? Well, the number one thing you see is people saying, I'm too small, I can't make a difference. It's the first reason that we get. The second is the problem's already, happened. Well, we've seen we can turn these things around dramatically. A child, Washington State University published a study 2 years ago that showed a child eating non-organic food will have many, many parts per million of pesticides in her or his urine. But if they switch over to organic food within 1 day, the pesticide in their urine disappears. We can fix ourselves. We can restore ourselves. Look what we've done with smoking. Look what we've done with seat belts. When we want to make something happen. And so we've just got to use that power. But we have to understand it's not enough. You can't sit by. You can't. As consumers and as citizens, we have to speak. Every email, every note you send out there telegraphs a message that, this government is of, for, and by me, not of, for, and by 5 or 6 chemical companies. So thank you for listening. I think we've got time for some questions, and there's some mics, so fire away. Yes, sir.
Mr. Rick, thank you for taking the time. I know that the artificial sweetener industry started a lot of this similarly with, this stuff is really safe. It's not going to cause any problems. I've had friends that were heavy users of artificial sweetener, develop leukemia, diabetes, brain tumors. Whether or not they're connected or not, I don't know. I do know that personally, every time I touch an artificial sweetener, it triggers anaphylaxis. It will kill me. I'm definitely concerned about what GMOs are going to do.
Yeah.
This is, from what I've seen so far, more of a political fight than anything else. It's not a common sense fight by any stretch. To that end, just how much do you think campaign finance reform would help this fight?
Yeah. Well, all roads, when you're dealing with environmental and health problems, issues that face our society, all roads lead to campaign finance reform. However you get there, because I unfortunately believe that we don't have elections anymore. I think we have sales, and it's tragic. I mean, ask Annie and Carol, our representatives, our congresspeople, how much time they're spending raising money. It's 50% of their time, and they're no different from congresspeople around the country. And now our state senators are. I mean, it's gotten to this level, or the amount of time that we're spending raising money when we ought to be legislating and working on common good. So, absolutely, there's no question. On the other hand, I have to tell you, I'm not bullish on the prospects. I mean, the sad thing is that when we think elections don't matter, you just come right back to New Hampshire, okay? Come back to the Gore-Bush race, okay? Here was Ralph Nader. I'm not remembering the numbers exactly, but essentially Ralph Nader got 22,000 votes in that ballpark, and Gore lost to Bush. I think it was something like 7,000 in New Hampshire. If Gore had won, he would have picked up those 4 electoral votes, and it would have been President Gore. And 3 of the Supreme Court justices who have ruled for Citizens United, and last year's, last week's ridiculous decision.
McCutcheon decision.
Yeah, probably wouldn't have happened. So right here in New Hampshire, we have a vivid example of the power. Ralph Nader, well-intentioned guy, but thank you, Ralph. That's what we've been delivered. Okay, so young people here, know your vote counts. This is a graphic example right in your backyard. Do not sit these things out. But unfortunately, these votes have, as you know, both of them 5-4. Right. So I believe it's absolutely critical. We've got to take the money out. Listen, I've run one, right? Corporations are not citizens too. Okay, let me tell you, as one who has run one for 30 years, we have advantages that citizens do not have. And you're seeing, graphic examples of it here. So you're right. We can go to aspartame. We can look at, energy policy. It's got to change. And I believe the way it can change is, again, with social media and with us marshaling our power, not just as voters, but also as consumers, to speak to these companies and say, I don't want you supporting this stuff, and I'm not going to support from you. I just have to tell you a very quick anecdote here. Sorry for the long answer, but I get worked up about this. I was once with I shouldn't name the name, but I was once with the CEO of a major supermarket chain, you would know the name, who told me that when they get 100 or 1,000 letters of praise, it's handled by somebody in his consumer relations department. But when they get 10 complaints, this is a major supermarket chain, they get read at the board level. Why? Because companies they may not be able to control their competition, they may not be able to control their supply chain, but they can definitely control their reputations. And if they get 10 complaints, this major Fortune 100 company had calculated that that's enough to cause some damage, and we better put out that fire. So, how many of us here tonight? 75, 100? I mean, let's, write a letter tonight to, let me go backwards. Let's do a little social experiment. Let's see what happens here. Let's go to Pepsi. Heck, let's write to Coke and Pepsi and say, I don't want you to be funding the Pompeo bill. I don't want you to be trying to make natural be genetically engineered. I know you guys have a lot of corn in your products, but I'm not going to buy your products if I see that you're supporting it. Because that's what it's going to take. These companies have to know it's in their economic interest to back off from this stuff.
I may have missed it, but did you actually get into the DARK Act at all?
Well, that's the Pompeo
That's the Pompeo
bill.
bill, but I
Yeah.
didn't hear you say anything about what that actually is.
Yeah, that's the 3 points I made earlier. The DARK Act it's codifying natural, it's preempting states, and then it's also requiring the federal government to have a voluntary policy.
The Deny Americans the Right to Know Act.
Right.
isn't-
DARK Act is, we're referring, it's a wonderful euphemism. It's DARK, Deny Americans the Right to Know. That's the Pompeo bill. That's not what he calls it, but that's what we should be calling it.
If you could you wish me luck? I'm submitting a business plan this week for a 6,000 square foot organic greenhouse.
Oh, no kidding. Good luck. We, let's support you. Yes, please. Anybody else?
Thank you for tonight.
Sure.
I'm Gail Prince. I have a small organic, well, it's not organic, small farm here in Bedford, and I give all my land and resources to refugees. And we really want to be organic, but it's so almost impossible to be organic. First of all, the cost of the seeds. We just bought non-GMO seeds for this year. That's money out of their pockets that they don't earn. The cost is just prohibitive. And then the administrative requirements to call yourself organic. We use all organic practices, but we can't call ourselves organics.
What do you estimate it costs you to get certified, your farm?
It's the man-hours and the paperwork, the
Yeah.
administrative. And I'm one of the few people that speak English and know how to use a computer, so, and a tractor and a car
Yeah.
and hose. So, and these people are great farmers. We don't have the money. Like I said, we follow organic practices.
Yeah.
But the paperwork and the administration required.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear
And
this a
the cost
lot.
of the seedlings, it's just, so a lot, when I talk to other farmers, you can buy produce at our farm, by the way.
What's the name of your farm?
It's Common Earth Farms.
Okay.
We share the earth. But it's just, I would love to see something that promotes, but we get a lot of customers because we advertise, we use non-GMO seeds.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest concern we find with our
Yeah,
American customers.
And by the way, this is a trend we're seeing now across the country. Non-GMO is really competing with organic. It's obviously not the same, as you point out, but it's at least a step in the direction. And we're seeing it across all commodity areas now that consumers who maybe can't afford organic or it's not available are looking for non-GMO. And that is part of the telegraphing of the message. You know, I would simply say to you on this that, I mean, you know, I mentioned this farm in Canterbury, which is obviously a larger farm, but Ness and Keg, you'll probably remember over here in Litchfield, went through the same thing. I mean, for sure there are upfront costs, but you know, again, we have 1,800 farms, and they average from the small to the pretty large, and you know, there are the economic models are pretty proven that over time, if you can overcome those initial costs, you can make a lot more money organically, and that's only increasing now, especially here in New Hampshire. But I understand the upfront costs, and I understand the
It's the
paperwork
administrative
issues.
paperwork and the
Yeah.
proving.
One of the things, Paul Doscher's here
Thank you.
from some of the early NOFA, one of our early NOFA colleagues. One of the things that I think NOFA and other groups needs to take up is ways that we could pool on the administrative side and help individual farmers. By the way, a couple of Paul and Deb's neighbors in Ware do organic seedling flats. Maybe you guys should chat before, just to see. So, yeah, we should maybe get you guys together. Any other questions? I know I threw a lot at you tonight, so yes.
I just have one question. With the biodynamic farms, as opposed to the organic farms, they are naturally organic, but do they say they're organic?
Well, so Stonyfield started as a biodynamic farm. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so the question is, biodynamic is different from organic farming, but do biodynamic farms tend to say that they're organic? Well, the first question is, are they certified? That's, you know, the good, organic's a funny business. It's the only industry sector I know in the whole world that has fought for more government regulation. Because we want, unfortunately, there's a paperwork, but we want it to mean something. Whereas I said earlier, the word natural doesn't mean anything. So you can't say you're organic unless you're certified organic. By law, you can't use the USDA symbol. But biodynamic is most certainly, or you can't be biodynamic without being organic, for sure. And that's how we began back in the day with Lincoln Geiger, who you know as one of our producers over in Wilton. But no, they don't always declare, because they don't always get certified, just like this woman from Bedford. Yeah, but if you're connected to a biodynamic farm, you're getting organic food. Anything else? All right, well, listen, we have to use our power. I appreciate that this is end of the school year. It's great that you all turned out tonight. But take me seriously. At the end of the day, especially you graduates, folks about to graduate, your power as consumers is much, much greater than you think. Stonyfield exists not because of our deep advertising budget, I promise you. We exist because individuals stood up and said, you know what, it's a better yogurt, I want that stuff. And we really can use this power in enormously productive ways. It's really, I think, the only hope we've got. So thank you again for listening tonight. Thanks.